was supposed to be just another one of those weekends you mark in your memory, you know? A break from routine to recharge, with nothing but good friends and nature around. Tom, Sarah, Jess, Mike, and I had chosen Yosemite National Park for our annual adventure. Unlike previous years, when we stayed near the more popular areas, this time we opted for a more secluded spot, close to a serene lake, surrounded by a dense forest and majestic mountains rising like sentinels around us. We arrived on a Friday afternoon, with clear skies and the sun still dominating the horizon. As we set up our tents, the excitement was palpable. We laughed, exchanged stories, and made plans for the days ahead. The chosen location was spectacular and tranquil, offering only the natural sounds of the wind in the leaves and the occasional calls of distant birds. It seemed the perfect setting for a retreat. As the sun set, twilight brought a calm, and we lit a campfire, settling around it. We shared stories and roasted marshmallows, enveloped in that typical joy of feeling at home in nature. However, as the night wore on, the darkness of the forest around us seemed to grow denser and more impenetrable. That's when the sounds began to change. At first, they seemed like the usual noises of a forest at dusk, but soon we noticed something different, something that didn't quite fit. Metallic sounds and almost inaudible whispers, like words murmured in an unknown language, emerged from the shadows beyond our campfire. We tried to dismiss them, attributing the noises to our collective imagination or perhaps to some animal playing with leftovers left by other campers. But there was something in the air, a cold sensation that seeped not just through the weather but through the cracks of our comfort. Those strange, persistent sounds began to weigh on our hearts with a growing sense that something was not right. As the night deepened, our cheerful conversations gave way to tense silence. Every snap of a branch or whisper of the wind seemed to carry a hidden threat. We laughed nervously, trying to break the tension, but fear had already settled into each of us, subtle but definite. That first night, under the starry mantle and the imposing shadow of the Yosemite Mountains, we began to realize that perhaps we were not as alone as we had imagined. Unbeknownst to us, we were on the threshold of something that would test us in ways we never expected. Those noises were just the prelude to a night that would mark the beginning of a story none of us could have predicted. And believe me, this was just the tip of the iceberg of what was to come in those isolated lands. As twilight gave way to total darkness, a dense silence began to envelop our camp in Yosemite, almost as if nature itself was warning us to stay alert. With the night advancing and the temperature dropping, we decided to retreat to our tents, seeking some comfort against the intensifying cold. But the tranquility of the night in the forest did not bring peace, but rather a series of noises that cut through the calm of the wild environment. The first sounds were subtle, almost imperceptible, like small cracks and whispers among the trees. They seemed natural, perhaps just nocturnal animals or the wind moving the branches. But as the night deepened, these sounds began to change, turning into scratches and dry knocks that seemed to come directly from outside our tents. It wasn't the random pattern of nature. These noises had an almost human rhythm, an intentionality that sent chills down our spines. Driven by a mix of courage and fear, I left the tent to investigate, holding my flashlight firmly. The beam of light cut through the darkness, illuminating only the still trees around, their shadows casting grotesque shapes on the ground. Despite the limited visibility, there was no sign of any animal or intruder. However, the noises continued, now accompanied by an almost inaudible whisper, as if the forest was murmuring ancient secrets in an unknown language. I returned to the relative safety of my tent, trying to convince myself and the others that perhaps it was just the sounds of nocturnal animals or the wind playing tricks on our fears. But internally, each of us felt that the reality was different. The night had brought something more than darkness, something that lurked in the black vastness, watching and waiting. The tension in the camp was palpable, and the feeling of being watched grew until it became an almost physical pressure against the thin canvas of the tents. No one could sleep that night. Lying in our sleeping bags, we listened intently, waiting and fearing what might be lurking in the darkness beyond our small circle of light. The forest, with its enigmatic sounds and movements, seemed to be enveloping us more than ever, guarding secrets that none of us really wanted to discover. Each shadow seemed to hide a presence. Each whisper of the wind seemed to carry a veiled message, turning that night into an experience of constant vigilance and frayed nerves. The dawn brought with it a brief relief from the tension accumulated the night before, but this comfort was short-lived. As we prepared our breakfast around the still-smoking campfire, we noticed something that made fear settle again in our hearts with renewed force. Around our tents, on the ground covered with leaves and dirt, there were footprints. They were not ordinary footprints. They looked like grotesque distortions of human feet, with toes that were too long and thin, deeply imprinted in the damp morning soil. No one spoke much during breakfast. We exchanged worried looks and, occasionally, one of us cast a nervous glance at the forest surrounding us. The silence was heavy, laden not only with fear but also with a dark curiosity about who or what had left those marks. We decided, with palpable hesitation, to follow the footprints. Maybe, we thought, we could find who was watching us, or at least understand what was happening. The trail led us deeper into the forest. The trees seemed to close in on us, their shadows like dark fingers reaching out towards us. The sun struggled to penetrate the dense canopy, and every step we took seemed to be watched by 1,000 hidden eyes among the leaves. The sounds of the forest, which would normally be comforting, now sounded like a sinister chorus, whispering secrets we were not sure we wanted to discover. The further we followed the footprints, the more irregular they became, as if the creature that left them was struggling to maintain a consistent form. Eventually, the footprints simply disappeared, as if the being had evaporated or risen above the forest floor. We stood there, in a clearing surrounded by ancient trees, feeling exposed and vulnerable. It was then that we heard a sound, a low crack, followed by an almost inaudible whisper, coming from all directions and none. It was as if the forest was breathing with us, living through us. The fear was palpable, and every shadow seemed to move with its own intent. We decided to return to the camp, our survival instinct finally overcoming our curiosity. The walk back was torturous. Each of us jumped at the slightest noise, at the slightest movement perceived out of the corner of our eye. When we finally emerged from the cover of the trees, the camp had never seemed so welcoming, nor the daylight so comforting. However, even that sense of safety was fragile, as we knew that something was out there, something watching us, waiting for its moment. And the uncertainty about what that something was fed our deepest fears, making it clear that the forest we thought we knew hid secrets much darker and deeper than we could ever imagine. Night fell upon us faster than we expected, with darkness swallowing the last rays of sun that sneaked through the ancient trees. The ensuing silence was dense, almost suffocating, interrupted only by the occasional crackling of our rekindled campfire. We were sitting around the fire, trying to find some comfort in the dancing flames before our eyes, when the unthinkable happened. A high-pitched scream shattered the calm of the night, so sudden and disturbing that we all jumped from our places. It was Sarah. The scream came from her tent. Without thinking twice, we ran towards the sound, our hearts pounding in a frantic rhythm, pulsing in our ears as loudly as our feet on the forest floor. Upon arrival, we found Sarah's tent open, the flaps of the entrance fluttering like the wings of a wounded bird. Inside, her sleeping bag was overturned, her belongings scattered around in complete disorder, as if a struggle had taken place there. The most alarming thing was that Sarah was not there. She had disappeared. Tom, with the flashlight in hand, illuminated a trail of belongings leading out of the tent and disappearing into the forest. We grabbed our flashlights and followed the path marked by small personal items of Sarah, each of us calling her name in the hope that she would respond, that it was all just a misunderstanding or a frightening prank. But there was no response. Only the sound of our own voices echoing among the trees, each call more desperate than the last. The trail led us deeper into the forest until the items stopped. There was nothing more, only the ground covered with leaves and the sound of our heavy breathing. We looked at each other, fear etched on every face, the reality of what was happening finally settling in. We returned to the camp, heavy-hearted and minds tormented by the worst thoughts. The night stretched endlessly, every sound making us jump, every shadow cast by the trees seeming to move. We knew something was very wrong and that, somehow, we had to find Sarah before it was too late. The forest, once a place of adventure and discovery, had turned into a dark labyrinth, hiding secrets that none of us wanted to know. The next morning, after our frustrating day of searching, something even more disturbing awaited us. Upon returning to camp after another unsuccessful attempt to find any trace of Sarah, something strange caught our attention. Hanging from a low branch of a tree near our camping area was an old video camera, apparently forgotten or deliberately placed there. I didn't remember seeing that camera the day before, and as far as we knew, we were isolated in this part of the park. Tom, with the caution of a predator, removed the camera from the branch and examined it. There were no signs of who had placed it there, only the growing certainty that someone or something was watching us closely. We returned to the campfire, and with everyone gathered, Tom pressed the playback button. What we saw next made our blood run cold. The recording showed our own camping area, filmed from an angle that covered all the tents. We could see ourselves moving around the camp, completely unaware of the camera's presence. But the most disturbing part was what happened while we slept. The camera captured shadowy, almost ethereal figures moving among the tents, pausing and leaning over us as we slept. These figures did not appear human. Their forms were distorted, as if made of mist and shadow, and their movements were unnaturally fluid, as if they were gliding above the ground. At the end of the video, the camera abruptly turned, as if capturing the movement of someone or something approaching. Then, all that remained was static, as if the camera had been knocked over or hastily turned off. The discovery of this video was a devastating blow. The idea that we were not alone and had been watched so closely during the night brought a new level of terror to our situation. The primal fear of being hunted, of being prey in a macabre game we didn't understand, rooted itself deeply in each of us. We decided that we couldn't spend another night in that place. The forest, with its dark secrets and hidden observers, had become too large, too threatening. As we packed our things, every noise made us stop, every shadow made us look over our shoulders. The haste to leave that place was palpable, but the feeling of being watched never left us, following us like a dark whisper that refused to be silenced. With every step we took away from the camp, one question remained. Could we really escape? After discovering the camera and watching the disturbing video, our group decided we couldn't stay another minute at that camp. We packed our things in silence, each lost in their thoughts, fearing what was yet to come. We decided to leave before nightfall, but as the forest seemed never-ending, twilight reached us faster than we expected. We were almost out of the densest part of the forest when we heard something following us. The sound of branches breaking and leaves rustling behind us quickened our pace. No one wanted to look back, but curiosity and fear mixed, forcing us to stay alert to any movement in the shadows forming with the falling night. Suddenly, a pale, distorted figure emerged from the mist that began to form among the trees. It was tall and slender, with movements that didn't seem natural, as if it were floating above the ground. Its face was indistinct, more a smear of paleness than a defined expression. Tom, the bravest among us, stopped and confronted the figure with an improvised torch we had made. He shouted something to us that we couldn't understand, his voice muffled by the distance that separated us. In the blink of an eye, a blinding light appeared out of nowhere, enveloping Tom and the figure. We covered our eyes with our hands, and when the light dissipated, Tom was gone. There was no sign of him, only the echo of his voice slowly fading into the forest. The shock and fear initially paralyzed us, but the need to survive made us run, leaving behind the place where our friend had been taken. We ran without looking back, guided only by the instinct to escape that nightmare. The trees passed us like dark blurs, and the sounds of the forest were now a terrible cacophony that seemed to celebrate our misfortune. The idea that we would be pursued by those dark creatures or whatever had taken Tom was a mental torture that pushed us forward, away from the darkness that tried to swallow us. Finally, exhausted and terrified, we found a path leading to a little-used road. Civilization had never seemed so welcoming. When we reached the road, we knew we had narrowly escaped, but the loss of Tom and the mystery of what really happened in that forest would stay with us, haunting our dreams and every moment of silence in our lives. The Yosemite forest kept its secrets well, and we had learned, the hard way, that some places are beyond human comprehension and should be left alone. As we reached the road, Jess and I felt relieved but still deeply shaken. The night's cold had settled in, and every shadow along the road seemed to watch us, whispering that we were not yet safe. We looked back one last time, half expecting to see those dark figures following us out of the forest, but there was only the silent darkness and the trees swaying in the wind. We walked along the road, not talking much, each step taking us away from that nightmare. After a while, we saw the lights of an approaching vehicle. It was a park ranger making his night rounds. I've never been so relieved to see a stranger. He found us exhausted, dirty, and clearly in shock. We tried to explain what had happened, but our words sounded disjointed, and our stories, although true, seemed like something out of a horror movie. The ranger took us to the park entrance, where we could finally call for help. We told the authorities everything that had happened, but without physical evidence and with the only proof being the camera that disappeared along with Tom, our stories seemed like the imaginings of people traumatized by tragedy. The searches for Sarah, Mike, and Tom were intense in the following days, but nothing was found, no trace of them or the creatures we described. In the days that followed, as we dealt with the trauma and loss, the Yosemite forest seemed to call to us in our dreams, a constant reminder of that terrible night. Authorities eventually called off the searches, concluding that our friends must have gotten lost in the forest or suffered some natural accident. Jess and I tried to resume our lives, but the memory of what we experienced in that forest remains with us. Sometimes, when night falls and the world around me goes silent, I can hear the whispers of the wind, eerily similar to the murmurs of those shadows in the forest. And deep down, I know the park keeps its secrets, some of which are too dark to be fully understood or accepted. Our return to normalcy is just a facade. The terror of that experience continues to haunt us. And as we try to move on, it's clear that some mysteries, like those we encountered in those ancient woods, are best left alone, shrouded by the darkness of the forest that hides them. And for those who stayed until now, I have prepared another spine-chilling story. Stay tuned for our bonus story, The Scream of the Forest, a night of relentless terror. My girlfriend, Sarah, and I decided it would be a good idea to spend a weekend camping in the Allegheny National Forest in Pennsylvania. The idea was to disconnect a bit from the hustle and bustle of everyday life and enjoy the peace and tranquility of nature. We arrived at our campsite in the late afternoon, just as the sun was setting, painting the sky with those orange and pink hues. We set up our tent near a clearing and lit a campfire. Everything was perfect, just as we had imagined. As the campfire crackled, we sat around it, roasting marshmallows and talking about how this place felt like paradise. However, as night fell and the sky darkened, I started to feel a strange sensation. It was as if someone was watching us, even though there was no one in sight. I tried to ignore it, thinking it was just my mind playing tricks on me. Sarah seemed relaxed, laughing and enjoying the night, so I let it go. After a while, we decided it was time to sleep. We got into the tent, settled into our sleeping bags, and talked a bit more before falling asleep. The night was incredibly quiet, and the only sound we heard was the gentle rustling of leaves swaying with the wind. I still had that unsettling feeling, but I forced my mind to calm down. After all, we were there to relax, not to let paranoia over things that probably didn't exist take over. Little did I know that this would be the last peaceful night we would have. As the night wore on, I lay in my sleeping bag, trying to ignore the uncomfortable feeling of being watched. The campfire outside had gone out, and the darkness seemed even more oppressive inside the tent. I could hear Sarah's soft breathing beside me, but my mind was alert, picking up every little sound in the forest. Suddenly, I heard a rustling in the leaves, as if someone or something was moving outside. My heart began to race. I lifted my head, trying to listen more closely. The sounds seemed to be getting closer. I looked at Sarah, who continued to sleep peacefully, unaware of what was happening. I tried to convince myself it was just an animal, maybe a deer or a raccoon, but the feeling of discomfort wouldn't leave me. I decided I needed to check. Carefully, I got up and grabbed the flashlight next to my sleeping bag. Opening the tent zipper as quietly as possible, I stepped out into the darkness of the forest. The flashlight's beam seemed weak against the vastness of the night, illuminating only a few meters ahead of me. My heart was pounding, and each step seemed to echo in the stillness. As I walked around the campsite, I felt the air was colder, almost icy. The rustling continued, now more intense, and seemed to come from all directions. My mind began to imagine things, shadows moving among the trees, figures lurking in the darkness. A shiver ran down my spine, and a sense of dread took over me. I returned to the tent, trying to calm myself. I quickly closed the zipper and lay down next to Sarah, who was now awake, looking at me with a worried expression. "Did you hear that?" I asked, my voice trembling a bit. She shook her head no, but her eyes showed that she was also starting to feel the fear. We tried to cuddle and sleep, but the feeling that something was wrong wouldn't leave us alone. The forest, which had previously seemed a tranquil refuge, now seemed full of invisible eyes, watching our every move. That sense of impending danger hung in the air, as if the forest itself was trying to warn us of something. We closed our eyes, but sleep wouldn't come, and the night seemed to stretch on forever, wrapped in suffocating darkness and disturbing silence. I was almost asleep when suddenly, a piercing scream cut through the silence of the night. It was a terrifying sound, unlike anything I had ever heard before. It was high-pitched, piercing, and seemed to come from all directions at once. My heart raced, and I sat up abruptly, looking at Sarah, who was also awake, her eyes wide with fear. The scream repeated, even louder and more desperate. It was impossible to tell if it came from a human or an animal, but it was clear that it was a cry of pure, simple despair. It seemed that the entire forest was amplifying that sound, making it echo among the trees and reach us with an almost physical intensity. Sarah and I looked at each other, not knowing what to do. Logic said to stay inside the tent, where we were relatively safe, but the curiosity and fear that someone might need help were almost irresistible. I grabbed the flashlight again and, with trembling hands, opened the tent zipper. The cold night air rushed in, bringing with it an even greater sense of danger. I stepped out of the tent and pointed the flashlight into the darkness, trying to locate the source of the screams. Sarah followed close behind me, gripping my arm tightly. The scream repeated once more, this time sounding more distant but still deafening. It was as if the forest itself was alive, screaming in agony. "We have to get out of here," Sarah whispered, her voice full of fear. I nodded in agreement, and we began to gather our things as quickly as we could. Fear made every second feel like an eternity. I tried to stay calm, but the feeling that something was watching us, getting closer, was inescapable. The screams continued, getting fainter but still present, like the echo of a nightmare that wouldn't end. Finally, with everything packed haphazardly, we started walking towards the car. Every step was a challenge. The fear paralyzed us, and the darkness seemed to swallow the little light the flashlight provided. I looked back one last time and was sure I saw something moving among the trees, but I couldn't make out what it was. That sight was etched in my mind, increasing the terror we felt. With the screams still echoing in the distance, we quickened our pace, desperately trying to leave that forest behind. That walk to the car felt endless. Every step we took, the sound of dry leaves crunching under our feet echoed in the darkness, amplifying the fear that was already consuming us. Sarah squeezed my hand so tightly it hurt, but I knew she was terrified, just like me. Suddenly, the flashlight began to flicker, dimming. Panic increased, and I started shaking it, trying to make it work again. The screams, though more distant, still echoed in the forest, creating an atmosphere of pure terror. When the flashlight finally went out, we were plunged into total darkness. I tried to remember the path in my head, but every tree, every shadow, looked the same. Sarah began to cry softly, and I felt the pressure to find a way out quickly. We walked blindly for a few minutes, guided only by instinct and the hope that we were going in the right direction. Then we heard a different sound. Footsteps, heavy and slow, as if something or someone was following us. The sound seemed to be getting closer, and the terror I felt was indescribable. I turned my head quickly, trying to see something in the darkness, but all I saw were moving shadows. With my heart in my mouth, I grabbed Sarah's hand and we started running. We ran without looking back, tripping over roots and stones, our lungs burning with effort and fear. The footsteps behind us continued, getting closer. It was as if the darkness itself had come to life, relentlessly pursuing us. Finally, we saw a clearing. There, under the pale moonlight, we saw our car. The feeling of relief was overwhelming, but we knew we were not yet safe. We ran as fast as we could, almost falling from exhaustion. When we reached the car, my hands were shaking so much that I had difficulty getting the keys out of my pocket. Sarah got into the car first, and I, with one last look at the forest, saw a figure lurking among the trees. It was tall, thin, and had eyes that glowed with a sinister light. I locked the car door and turned the key in the ignition, our heavy breathing filling the silence of the vehicle. We sped away, the screams and footsteps finally left behind. Whatever was chasing us seemed to have stayed in the forest. But I knew we would never be the same. Something that night had changed us forever. We drove like mad down the dirt road, the darkness of the forest closing in around us, each shadow seeming like a threat. Sarah sobbed quietly next to me, still trembling with fear. I tried to stay calm, but my heart was beating so hard it felt like it would burst out of my chest. The car shook and bounced with every pothole in the road, but I didn't slow down. I just wanted to get out of there as quickly as possible. After what felt like hours, we finally reached a paved road. The sense of relief was immense, but the fear hadn't completely passed. Sarah calmed down a bit but kept looking back, as if expecting to see that sinister figure following us. I tried to focus on the road, but my mind was racing, reliving every moment of the terror we had experienced. Do you think it was human? Sarah asked, her voice trembling. I didn't know what to answer. Everything that night defied any logical explanation. I just shook my head, trying to push away the images that continued to haunt me. Finally, we saw the lights of a small gas station. It looked like an oasis in the middle of the desert. I parked the car and turned off the engine, trying to take a deep breath and regain some composure. We entered the station, and the attendant, an older man with a tired look, watched us curiously. We must have looked terrible. I asked to use the phone since our cell phones had no signal in the forest. I called the local police and reported what had happened, but the response I received was discouraging. They said they would send someone to investigate, but they probably wouldn't find anything in the darkness. Sarah and I sat at a table in the station's small cafe, trying to calm down with a cup of hot coffee. Every sound, every movement outside, made our hearts race again. We felt like we were still being watched, even there, under the fluorescent lights of the gas station. The attendant tried to reassure us, saying that the forest was full of strange sounds and that it was probably nothing to worry about. But I knew he was wrong. What we saw, what we heard, was not something ordinary. It was something we could never forget. After a while, we decided it was best to continue the journey until we found a safe place to spend the night. We got back in the car, still nervous, and continued down the road. The fear was still there, a constant shadow in our minds, but we knew we had to keep moving forward. As I drove, I couldn't stop thinking about what might be out there in the darkness. I knew that somehow, that experience had marked us forever. Something in that forest had touched us in a deep and disturbing way, and I didn't know if we would ever truly escape that fear. After leaving the gas station, we drove in silence for some time, still shaken by what had happened. The headlights cut through the darkness of the road, but they couldn't illuminate the fear that still hung over us. Whatever was in the forest seemed to have stayed behind, but the feeling of being watched hadn't disappeared. We decided to find a motel to spend the night and try to rest a bit. We found a simple place by the roadside, the typical roadside motel with a flickering neon sign. We parked the car and went to the reception, where a curious receptionist looked at us but didn't ask any questions. We got the room key and headed there, still in silence. When we entered the room, we locked the door and checked the windows, ensuring we were safe. Sarah sat on the bed, still trembling a bit. I sat next to her, trying to think of something comforting to say, but the words eluded me. The fear of that night was still very present, and I knew we wouldn't sleep easily. After a few minutes, Sarah suggested we take a hot shower to try to relax. While she was in the bathroom, I took the opportunity to turn on the TV, hoping some background noise would help distract our minds. But every sound from the TV seemed distorted, amplifying the feeling of discomfort. When Sarah came out of the bathroom, it was my turn to try to relax under the hot water. As the water fell over me, I tried to push away thoughts of the figure we saw in the forest, but it was impossible. Those glowing eyes, the thin silhouette. It was something I had never seen before and hoped never to see again. After the shower, we lay down on the bed, but sleep wouldn't come. We lay there in the dark, listening to the sounds of the motel. Every noise seemed suspicious, every shadow a threat. Finally, after a long time, exhaustion overcame us, and we eventually fell asleep. I woke up in the middle of the night to a strange sound coming from outside the room. It was a low rustling, similar to what we heard in the forest. My heart raced again, and I sat up in bed, trying to listen more closely. Sarah woke up too, her eyes wide with fear. We stayed there, paralyzed, listening to the sound that seemed to be getting closer. I decided we couldn't just sit there waiting. I got up slowly and went to the window, pulling the curtain slightly to peek outside. In the parking lot, under the dim light of the streetlights, I didn't see anything unusual, but the feeling that something was wrong wouldn't leave me. I returned to the bed, trying to calm Sarah and myself. Finally, the sound stopped, and we stayed in absolute silence, trying to catch any sign of movement. When the sun began to rise, the tension finally eased a bit. We decided it was best to leave that place as soon as possible. We packed our things quickly and left the room, still alert but relieved to see the daylight. That night in the motel left us even more shaken. The fear had followed us, and we knew that something beyond the ordinary was happening. We left the motel and continued our journey, hoping that, with the daylight, the terror we faced would finally stay behind. But the truth is, we knew deep down that we would never be the same after that experience. We left the motel as soon as the sun rose, still feeling the weight of the fear that had accompanied us from the forest. We hit the road again, with no specific destination in mind, just the need to get as far away from that place as possible. Sarah was silent, looking out the window, lost in her own thoughts. I drove, trying to stay calm, but the feeling that something was following us wouldn't leave me. As the day progressed, we decided to stop in a small town to eat and try to regain some normalcy. We found a simple diner and went inside. The welcoming environment and the people talking seemed such a stark contrast to the terror of the previous night that we almost felt out of place. We ordered coffee and sandwiches, but while we waited, I couldn't help but notice something strange. People were looking at us curiously, as if they knew something had happened. When the waitress brought our order, she leaned in and asked softly, "Are you coming from the Allegheny Forest?" I nodded, not knowing what to expect. She looked around, making sure no one was listening, and whispered, "You need to be careful. There are stories about that forest. Things that no one can explain." A shiver ran down my spine. I asked what she knew, but she just shook her head, murmuring something about old legends, and walked away quickly. Sarah looked at me with wide eyes. We didn't need more mysteries to add to our fear. We finished our meal quickly and returned to the car, determined to move on. But as the road stretched out before us, the feeling of being watched returned with full force. We decided we needed to find a place where we could feel truly safe, where we could try to understand what was happening without the constant sense of danger. We drove for hours, and the landscape around us began to change. The dense trees of the forest gave way to open fields, and the sky seemed clearer, less oppressive. Then we saw a small inn by the roadside, a place that looked welcoming and safe. We decided that this was where we would spend the night. The owner of the inn, a friendly elderly woman, greeted us warmly. As she showed us to the room, I noticed that she also seemed to know more than she was letting on. There was a hint of worry in her eyes, but she didn't mention anything about the forest or what might be troubling us. When we finally settled into the room, Sarah lay down on the bed, exhausted. I sat next to her, looking out the window, watching the night fall. The fear was still there, a constant presence, but the hope that we were far from danger began to surface. But then, right in the middle of the night, I woke up to a sound. A familiar rustling, coming from outside the window. My heart raced, and when I looked out the window, I saw that figure again. Thin, tall, with glowing eyes in the darkness. It was the same presence that had chased us in the forest. I woke Sarah, and we both stood paralyzed, staring at that figure. It didn't move, just watched us. The feeling of absolute terror returned with full force. Something was there, something we couldn't understand or explain, and it was following us. I knew at that moment that the only way to end this would be to confront whatever it was. But how do you do that when you're so terrified? The figure standing outside the window didn't move, and the feeling of absolute terror took over us. Sarah clung to me, her face pale with fear. I knew we couldn't keep running. We had to face whatever it was. I took a deep breath and whispered to Sarah, "Stay here, I'm going out to see what this is." She tried to protest, but I reassured her, promising I would be back soon. I grabbed a flashlight and a kitchen knife. It was all I had to defend myself. With trembling hands, I opened the room door and walked down the stairs of the inn towards the garden. The figure was there, motionless, eyes glowing in the dark. I felt a cold shiver run down my spine, but I kept walking, determined to end this. With each step I took, the figure seemed more real, more threatening. "Who are you? What do you want?" I shouted, trying to keep my voice steady, but it came out shaky. To my surprise, the figure started to move, but not to approach me. Instead, it dissipated into the darkness, as if it were made of smoke. I stood there, confused and with my heart racing. I knew this wasn't normal. Something was very wrong. Suddenly, I felt a cold hand on my shoulder. I turned quickly, almost striking with a knife, but it was the innkeeper. She had a serious expression on her face and pulled me back inside. "You need to leave here now," she said urgently. "What you saw, it's an ancient entity. It can't be defeated, only avoided." I was stunned, trying to process what she was saying. "But what is it? Why is it following us?" She shook her head. "No one knows for sure. They say it's the spirit of someone who died in the forest, trapped between worlds. But one thing is certain. Once it chooses a victim, it doesn't stop until it gets what it wants." With those words, the gravity of the situation finally sank in. I ran back to the room where Sarah was waiting, still terrified. I quickly explained what the innkeeper had said. We both knew we had to leave immediately. We packed our things as fast as we could and ran to the car. As I drove, I looked in the rearview mirror, expecting to see the figure following us, but the road was empty. Sarah was silent, but I could see the tears streaming down her face. As we drove away from the inn, I started to feel a slight sense of relief. Maybe we were finally free from that entity. But the truth is, I never knew for sure. To this day, I have nightmares about those glowing eyes in the darkness. And whenever I'm alone in a dark place, I feel like I'm still being watched. That experience changed our lives forever. We decided never to speak about that night again, but the fear still lives within us. I know that somehow, that thing is still out there, waiting. And all we can do is try to forget and move on, knowing that the terror of that night will never completely leave us. If you liked these stories, you can't miss the story of a family that moves into a charming Victorian house in Salem, Massachusetts, seeking a fresh start, but soon discovers that the promised tranquility is an illusion. The house reveals a dark past of occult rituals and human sacrifices. With inexplicable noises and disturbing whispers, the family finds themselves forced to confront a malevolent presence that feeds on their fear. To unveil the secrets of this house, watch the video here in the card or look for the previous video to this one on the channel. And, of course, leave your like, subscribe to the channel, and tell us in the comments if you have ever had a paranormal experience as well. Stay brave and see you in the next macabre story.